Hello everyone. In this science jam, we'll be talking to Dr. Bittu Rajraman. Dr. Bittu is currently an associate professor of biology and psychology at the Ashoka University. He completed his PhD from Harvard University in neuroscience and was an inspired faculty at National University of Hyderabad. He was also a DST Dr. D.S. Kothari postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ecological Sciences at Indian Institute of Science, where he studied the evolution of mental and behavioral systems of communication among orthopteran insects in response to ecological conflicts. So, in this episode of the Science Jam, we'll be talking to Dr. Bittu and getting to know his work as a neuroscientist and his why he decided to study it in the first place. So, as a part of a collaboration with Project Encephalon, I'll be conducting this interview with Shekhar. Shresht is a fourth-year biology student at ICER TPM and is a neuroenthusiast, just like Dr. Bittu. So, Shresht, would you like to take the lead?
Yeah, definitely. So we'll start with the first question. Neuroscience is one of the most celebrated fields in biology, and it has generated a lot of interest. So the first question from me to you would be, what inspired you to pursue it in the beginning? And if you could just tell us about your academic journey till now, in your own words.
The same stuff that presumably, interested you and many other people. I was just, I was interested always in thought, right? I think all of academia is about thought, right? All of academia, whatever stream of academia one is in, and even if one's not an academic at all, right? Much of one's day, if humans are just intensely interested in each other's behavior, right? So people who really don't identify as academics, they still have a day-to-day and minute-to-minute interest in other human beings and what they're thinking and so on. It was always sort of completely fascinating to me that these thoughts emerge from a biological system, right? Like a wet, gooey system, right? So it was just, when I was in school, the idea blew my mind and I just wanted to know more. And I was quite relentless actually in wanting to know more. So at that stage, in college, there were places where one could do an undergrad degree in neuroscience, and I did a degree in biochemistry, an undergrad degree in biochemistry in Delhi University, because our options were quite limited then, right? Zoology, biochemistry was these very sort of strict siloed kind of things, and so I actually, after 2 years in Delhi University, just like decided to leave and transfer to a college where I could do neuroscience and evolution. And I was in a really fantastic biochemistry course, but I was so hungry for this stuff that I was just looking for places where I could directly access that kind of information, that kind of, not just that information, but that sort of window into an understanding of the brain and how brains evolve, right? How in fact, at the time I was just interested in evolution more broadly, not just in evolution and neuroscience and their overlap, which is just happening with years of thinking about both of these things separately now. I transferred, actually spammed all. I'd like to, can I study these things at your college, and is it possible for international students to get scholarships to transfer into your college? And these are the kinds of like spam emails that I'm sure most the bane of most department administrators' existence. But a few people actually sent me responses, and one college actually sent me an application with an application fee waiver in the mail, which made it suddenly much more accessible and real. And so I applied there and got in, and there was rounds of haggling over scholarship and how I needed it, and then eventually I went there. So I did 2 years in Delhi University, and then 2 years exclusively doing sort of evolution and neuroscience as an undergrad, and then got a lot of interesting summer experiences at Cold Spring Harbor, Princeton, and so on. And then went on to do grad school to go to grad school at Harvard, and did a 5-year PhD, where I started off feeling like I had to choose at the time, because again, a lot of people were working on both evolution and neuroscience, with the exception of one person at Stanford. Maybe I should have worked with him. Shout out to Russ for now, who's worked on very, very cool stuff. But I ended up not doing that, and I ended up working in a essentially a pure neuroscience lab. But the mind sort of keeps wandering back to the questions that fascinate one, right? So I ended up working on an evolutionary project when it came to the neural system that I was looking at, which was salamander retinae. I was looking at the kinds of cells which are what are called intrinsically photosensitive, that is, when there's no rod and cone input, are there other cells in the retina that respond to light? And it turns out that there are. That's also an evolutionary holdover from sort of stages of evolution in the eye where the eye essentially seems to be composed of photoreceptors, of which some then sometimes take on processing roles, but then they can still have leftover pigments, so they can continue to express pigments from sort of a history of being photoreceptors, and two lineages of photoreceptors seem to course through most animal lineages. Sometimes with sampling, accessory roles, sampling roles where you lose rods and cones, where you lose primary vision, sampling, different roles. So I was looking at one such system, the system that actually helps us do circadian rhythm regulation. So if you lose your rods and cones, but no other part of your retina, people can still maintain a sense of circadian rhythm relative to the day-night cycle. So that was the system I was working on in salamanders, and I ended up, then this evolution, how eyes evolved, sort of was really part of what interested me in that system. Even though what I was doing was actually characterizing the system in a non-mammalian vertebrate, because the system was largely understood in mammals, and I was interested in comparative work which shed light on the evolution of the system. And so then I decided that I should, not see sort of science as these two different trajectories that I should choose from, but that, the fact that I was interested in both would continue to make me, keep looking for the evolution of kind of neural systems, or questions that fit both. And I also wanted to do more, evolution in the wild stuff. So I wanted to look at systems where I understood the ecological conditions in which evolution is taking place in the wild. I didn't want to do the kinds of evolution where you take a system that's studyable in the lab and do artificial evolution in the lab. It's just because I don't enjoy lab work as much as I enjoy field work. And I also wanted to look at a system. So I wanted to look at a system which would allow me to go back into the forest and there watch evolution take place, and there look at how neural systems, solve problems, and at the ecological constraints driving evolution in real time, because in the lab we impose these constraints, and I want to figure out what the constraints were in the wild. I was telling people that I was interested in this stuff, and lots of people said, well, you should talk to Rohini, who ended up being my postdoc supervisor. They said she's interested in the same kinds of questions. So it was really a question of many people saying this is the person to talk to. And so she's a behavioral ecologist, and I had a sort of the fortune to do things that postdocs are not usually allowed to get away with in other places with her, which is that I was allowed to learn while I was postdocing, instead of just continuing to produce what I produced during my thesis, right? Which is that kind of flexibility. Actually, the US is famous for flexibility in terms of what you want to do, but that flexibility extends to people before grad school, right? And after grad school, you're expected to just produce, right? You're expected to produce and you're really expected to do, to give PIs who hire you full paisa vasuli, right? It's a fairly kind of contractual system. So I was very lucky, and I had 3 years of a lovely postdoc looking at that system, and I continue to work on questions of how neural systems evolve in those systems. But now I also work, and then I went on to teach at the University of Hyderabad for 3 years. Also did some projects on ant vision, and a whole bunch of small different kinds of projects depending on what directions the students wanted to go in. And I started to look at zebrafish because a student was interested in looking at zebrafish there. And that then, how these animals who are perceiving song, how they perceive time, because song is just patterns of movement of the air or in time. And I became more broadly interested in how quantities are perceived and numbers and so on are perceived. I started to ask some of those questions in zebrafish because it seemed like a good model system to do that. And we also do some work with dogs because they're another good model system in which to do quick behavioral experiments that can be crowdsourced and that many students, especially over the pandemic, can do from their homes. So that's the rough trajectory.